Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissism and healing from narcissistic relationships. So, I gotta tell you, we can't let this channel go without talking about The White Lotus. I almost never watch TV series while they're still popular. I watch them like 1,000 years later, but I was with all of you on Sunday night when that finale came. I actually don't think this video has spoilers, so if you're still watching, but I love The White Lotus season 2. I really love season 1. I think I like season 1 better. But The White Lotus season 2 is actually really, once again, television writers doing a phenomenal job of writing narcissistic or narcissism adjacent characters. So let's take a little tour through narcissism in The White Lotus. I'm going to try to work my way up to what I consider the biggest narcissistic person on the show. But let me tell you, I don't have all the answers. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of this and weigh in on some of these characters. I may not get to everyone. I'm certainly going to try, but I'm going to try to get as many of them as I can remember. So let's start with, I'm going to start with Albie, okay? Listen, when I was in college, I would have really loved having an Albie as a boyfriend. He's handsome, he's sweet, he's open-minded, he's progressive, kind of my dream date, right? But Albie, I'm telling you, not only is Albie not narcissistic, he's actually quite agreeable. Now, one thing we know about agreeableness is it's a tricky quality for a man, right? Because I think it's the best quality a man could possibly have. That's me, that's my opinion. But some of the research shows that agreeable men actually make less money. But Albie's agreeableness, which keeps him from being sort of like an alpha male dominator of Portia. However, then he goes ahead and falls in love with his Sicilian sex lady. Is that at the very end, and this is what I love about Albie's character, when the rubber met the road, he was actually, he got a little bit, I liked how he negotiated with his dad. I tipped my hat, and that showed us a depth of Albie, agreeable, but with a little bit of a punch in there, but Albie, not narcissistic. Let's keep going in Albie's family. Let's talk about Albie's dad, whose name I'm forgetting now. Albie's dad. Okay, Albie's dad. Now, I know some of you are thinking Albie's dad, because that's a 3-generational family. So Albie, not narcissistic. Albie's dad. I know you're all sitting here thinking Albie's dad is narcissistic. Ish. I have to tell you, until I really if I could get to know Albie's dad more, what I'm trying to discern with Albie's dad is sex addiction versus narcissism. Okay? They're not synonymous. And in Albie's dad's case, clearly this dude is compulsive and dysregulated with sex. Blew up his marriage, kind of lost his daughter over this, makes pre-arrangements to have a commercial sex worker come to his hotel room on a family vacation, like sex addiction. What I found fascinating about Albie's dad was, as the series went on, he clearly was still linked into the marriage. That felt a little hoovery to me, no doubt about that. And I don't know if he was sufficiently apologizing and making true amends for what he did. I found it interesting, though, the complexity of his relationship with his son and what he was trying to do there. So I definitely think that Albie's dad is in the narcissistic neighborhood for sure. Don't let the sex stuff confuse you, though, because there could be something else operating there. Definitely not my dream date when I was in college. But this is where we see that things get a little bit hazy and tricky. Now let's go to Bert, Albie's grandfather. What I love about the three of these guys together is the intergenerationality of it. Albie's grandfather, again, I'd say pretty narcissism adjacent. Here in Albie's grandfather, though, with his sort of Sicilian kind of probably patriarchal, hierarchical background, we see a guy who brings a lot of that sort of cultural narcissistic stuff. Privilege, a certain amount of entitlement, a carelessness in terms of how he views women, how he views relationships with women. His son, so Albie's dad, Bert's son, the sex addict guy, clearly saying to him, like, you hurt my mother. He cheated on the mother. So again, how intergenerational these cycles are. The grandfather Definitely some narcissistic-y stuff there. There's definitely a lack of self-awareness. He invites people to join them, come on our day trip and all of that. But all those day trips and things, like inviting people, I should say, it feels more like a source of supply. Look, a beautiful woman is going to be with us versus this sort of big well of empathy. But when the moment came that the second girlfriend of Albie, the woman he was basically paying or was being paid by men to have sex with her, when she was sort of being abducted, the grandfather was like, you're just going to let her be abducted? But he didn't stop it either. So again, what we see here intergenerationally, I find fascinating, is definitely some narcissistic-y stuff in the grandfather, narcissistic-y stuff in the dad, a lot of the dysregulated sex in the grandfather, which was really bad in the son, and then the grandson, Albie, you actually see an agreeableness come out. What I liked about that sequencing is that it didn't mean that Albie was doomed, despite these rather sort of dysregulated generations ahead of him. However, Albie also had to experience and endure the difficult marriage of his parents. So that's my thoughts on that family in terms of the narcissistic stuff there. So now let's hop on over to Tanya. Tanya. Bless her. I got to tell you, I mean, how could you not? Like, Tanya was the character. She's one of those iconic television characters, which we will be talking about for years. Now, Tanya's husband, Greg, I would definitely say very narcissistic-y, maybe even psychopathic-ish, for in terms of how he is not only unkind, cruel, dismissive, grifting, running a hustle, but again, without spoiling it too much, kind of even worse, and seems to have no remorse. So we're going to put Tanya's husband either in the realm of malignant narcissism, dark tetrad, psychopathic stuff. So not cool. Tanya. This is a complicated character, and this is where I say, like, television writers must have all studied, like, probably even better than a lot of psychologists at narcissism, in the sense of, here you have this character that shows tremendous entitlement, lots of privilege, right? Brings the assistant on vacation because basically she's an adult woman who needs a babysitter. Think back to season 1 and what she did to the woman who was the healer, who worked in the spa, and how she got one over on her and took advantage of her. Tanya, in this incredibly careless way, takes advantage of people that she meets and has such a vast amount of wealth, she's almost insulated from the consequences. For these moments, you see that Tanya has something that kind of looks like empathy. Like, she seemed to care about the healer in season 1. And in season 2, she'll have a minute where it seems like she's actually attuned to someone else, but it's only for a minute. So Tanya definitely, again, has some of these sort of lower grade narcissistic vibes, but it comes out as this careless cluelessness, which, if you're on the receiving side of it, is a lack of empathy. Clearly, her assistant is shredded from having to work with her, and one could speculate that she really did hurt that healer from season 1 who thought there was something real happening here. So her character, again, is that what happens when you have the wealth, the privilege, the insulation, the entitlement, the privilege, almost as though there was no point in growing that empathy muscle. And we don't quite understand her childhood, although there seemed like a lot of money and sort of this romantic vision of what her parents were, and it seems like she was quite ignored a lot and just kind of jumped from bad relationship to bad relationship to bad relationship and to the ultimate bad relationship. So them's my thoughts there. So let's not forget, when we talk about Tanya and Greg, let's not forget about Tanya's assistant, Portia. This is the sort of 50-something old woman I am. I didn't like Portia. I found her a little bit too muchy too, but I think it was probably a little bit of an internalized bias I had in me. I can't imagine what it would be like to work with someone like her, but then again, I also have never been taken on a luxurious Sicilian vacation in the name of a job. That said, Portia was clearly incredibly anxious. If anything, what I saw in Portia, though, despite my finding her like quivering nerviness getting on my nerves, was a anxious propensity to a trauma-bonded relationship. And you remember that whole sequence, how she couldn't connect with Albie, but then with the strange and traumatized British man, she was all in on that. Like that dude was wearing his trauma, like it was as though it was dripping off of him. And then she felt that instant affinity to someone who clearly wasn't good for her. But she goes all in on that. That to me spoke to Portia's had some sort of trauma bonded history, and that was playing out in her adult relationships. Do I see narcissism there? No, because what I found interesting about Portia was no matter how infuriating this boss was, I do think that she became genuinely concerned that kind of needed to keep an eye on this woman. Though, when we really think about it, kind of how diffident she finally was when it came to her boss, I'm on the fence about that. But some of that I saw in Portia as being sort of a youthful insouciance of like, ugh, I can't be bothered kind of thing. So, but I still don't even think Portia. I think Portia more trauma bonded. So now let's go to the quartet of Ethan and Harper, Cameron and Daphne. Because here's where we're getting to the money shot on narcissism. Ethan and Harper, let's start with there. I was not a fan of Harper. I found the snark and the passive aggressiveness really started exhausting me after a while. It's just not a kind of person I'd want to spend time with. And probably I didn't like Harper because there was a little bit there of me because I don't always love spending time with people I don't like. But Harper was just a little like I wanted her to turn down the passive aggression, but there's something happening there. And I honestly thought as the season went on, she was getting more, there was this insecurity that was coming out about her husband's newfound, the wealth that he had accumulated because he had sold his company and where that would put her. And I think that the increase in her sort of seemingly antagonistic behavior was in response to the sort of diminishment in intimacy in the relationship and the increase in insecurity in her. Do I think she's narcissistic? I didn't even get that vibe from her there. And the reason, a big part of this video I want you to pay attention to, it's so easy to say everyone on the White Lotus is narcissistic. I'm really struggling with how much people are overusing the word. It's actually, there was a narcissistic scent over the whole show. But when you start breaking it down character by character, you can see not as much as you would think. Ethan was a very interesting character. Again, these folks were so tightly wound on this show, despite all the wealth, all the privilege, the ability to take a 5-figure vacation. There was this existential discomfort that they all had. I don't think Ethan was narcissistic either. I think Ethan was somebody who had given, if anything, he sort of had that obsessive, compulsive personality vibe, work all the time. It ended up rewarding him greatly. I remember in that scene where he just sort of has the laptop and he's working away in his bed while she's reading at night, and they're in this beautiful place. And so everything for him had become really compartmentalized, even sex. Here he is sort of jerking off to the porn video that he was watching rather than having sex with his wife. And when his wife did want to approach him and want to have an intimate encounter with him, it was all about he had to do his run at first thing in the morning. He had to, he was working all the time. He had his, he even had a routine with how he would, masturbate. So all of those things together, it was as though he had become this highly robotically controlled person, but brimming under him, there was all this feeling. And that feeling, well, let's switch over to Daphne and Cameron, the other couple who came with them on vacation. Daphne may have been one of the most interesting characters of the season, bar none, from my seat as somebody who cares deeply about narcissism. Because what Daphne was to me was the person who decides to stay in the narcissistic relationship and has figured out the workarounds. So Daphne, the intimation was that Daphne had at times maybe a side piece outside of the relationship. She was living a very comfortable life. There were the kids. She enjoyed her husband, but otherwise was sort of blithely unaware of him. There was this kind of interesting superficial indifference she was able to make. She kind of seemed like the only one who was kind of chilling on vacation. Everyone else was like, I'm going to find my ancestors. Or they were just this tense. And she's like, I'm just going to read my magazine and chill on the beach and have a grand old time. But what was fascinating to me about Daphne was when a person has to survive a deeply narcissistic relationship, there's a funny kind of edge. It's like the crust on top of something that forms. And that was there for her, right down to what I do think was a seduction scene of her and Ethan, almost saying like, honey, this is how I figured it out, and that's why I'm okay with it. So to me, Daphne was one of the most interesting depictions of the person who's found the workarounds in the narcissistic relationship with the person who was by far, no holds barred, the number one narcissist on the show, which was Cameron. Over and over and over, his contemptuousness, his lack of empathy, his relative indifference, his arrogance, his grandiosity, his need for attention and validation, to I'm the guy, I'm the man. And really, the whole going on the whole vacation was him trying to run a grift on Ethan and get Ethan to now invest these newfound many, many millions with him, while also trying to keep Ethan in his place because he was threatened by him. Cameron was all narcissist all the time. The winner of the show. That if there was, obviously it was a whodunit, but as far as the narcissism whodunit, it was all Cameron. He was it. And that's where I'm saying his wife was dealing. I don't know that the wife was narcissistic as much as she had to survive this toxic relationship and had no intention of getting out of it. So had figured out how to live in it. And in a way was almost letting, like I said, Ethan know that day on the beach, this is how I did it. So that was definitely by far Cameron wins. But we can't forget some of these other characters who, although they were in the position of having to sort of serve these guests, their characters were quite compelling as well. Valentina, the manager of the hotel, and let's face it, in the White Lotus, the managers of the hotel are probably some of the most interesting characters. Valentina's not narcissistic. Again, Valentina tightly wound as she, because of her role, perhaps because of her culture, because of whatever it is, hasn't been able to feel fully in her identity as a woman who wants to be, who either identifies as lesbian or queer, or wants to be with other women, and in her attempt to be vulnerable with somebody who worked at the hotel with one of the desk clerks, she was actually in some ways kind of being a harasser herself, moving staff around so she could have access to this person, having poor boundaries, asking that staff member to have a drink with her. So it was very interesting to see sort of, if you will, the kind of workplace harasser be a woman, because really in many ways, if a man was doing what Valentina was doing, we would be much more clear dynamic, but that's what Valentina was doing. She was abusing her power in that situation. What we could see, though, is, again, Valentina at those times wasn't really showing empathy. So again, narcissism adjacent. But over time, I felt like she was still like, okay, go ahead and play the piano and we're going to get to those two girls in a minute. But the fact is that she was a very interesting character, but again, not full on sort of narcissistic. We absolutely cannot forget about probably who could be called the two winners of the series, Lucia and Nina. Lucia and Nina were two young women. Lucia, it sounds like, had really sort of mastered the craft of hustling guests at this high-end hotel and sort of a sex for money kind of thing, and getting paid 2,000 euros for each night she'd spend with someone. Valentina, the hotel manager, did not want these young women in her hotel, but then the Albie's sex addict father had then paid so they could be basically guests at the hotel and have access to everything that the property had to offer, giving them tremendous access. While Lucia was really in it for the hustle, she wanted the money, she wanted the stuff the money would buy, Mia wanted to be a musician. And so Mia employed her feminine wiles to seduce the existing piano player who was actually a bit of a harasser, power abuser himself. And then through a series of things that aren't really relevant to what we're doing here, Mia then ultimately is able to win over Valentina and is allowed to play the piano in the lobby, allowing Mia to explore those dreams of music. With Lucia, she is somebody who has just sort of learned the fine art of the hustle and ended up hustling or having sex with 3 men in the hotel that week, getting money from 2 of them. and then getting a lot of money from one of them. And so those two characters are fascinating because, like I said, they were sort of the big winners of the week. Not only did they get to remain at the hotel for the week, then they walked off with an enormous, enormous payday, one that would be game changing. And Lucia even ran the hustle of having one of her friends behave like a scary kind of a enforcer pimp, and he was just sort of, it sounds like, her sweet friend, and it made the whole story sellable. That kind of a grift, that kind of lying, we don't get to see. We get to see such a one-dimensional picture of Lucia and frankly of Mia to even determine whether or not they have empathy or any of those other things. They're young, and one thing we do know about when we think about narcissistic personalities, I kind of always hedge my bets until someone's over 25. It's clear these two girls were not, or two young women were not over the age of 25. So we'll have to see how that rolls out for them. I have a feeling that especially Lucia's personality may get more harsh as she gets older. She thinks she's always going to be a handful. As long as Mia gets her musical dreams, her personality may sort of shape into something that might be a little less antagonistic. It's hard to know. Again, this is why we don't ever want to sort of give personality a kind of a firm name much under the age of 25 as it still forms. I got to tell you, the White Lotus, which was, I've never been to Sicily, but it was a glorious tour around Sicily. It was honestly even a more glorious tour around the subtleties of narcissism. And as our last bit, what about all those guys that Tanya fell in with, Quentin and all the rest of them? Now that was sheer narcissism all the way through, and possibly even psychopathy. That willingness to do a grift, the amount of harm they're willing to engage in to get this woman's money, and how elaborate their entire scheme was, and how cruelly it played on this woman's vulnerability. That, again, the malignant, narcissistic, psychopathic kind of absolute disregard for human life. The only piece of advice, if you only got one piece from the White Lotus, never get on a yacht with a bunch of charming strangers. But if you've been watching this channel long enough, you already knew that. So let me tell you, the White Lotus, a real treasure on how subtle narcissism is. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'm sure a lot of you don't agree with me and have some strong feelings about the way I shaped out the characters. Let me know your thoughts. But like I said, until you fully get to know someone and you only have that superficial look, it's sometimes easy to think that they may be narcissistic. But even with that superficial look, the only thing we often do know is you just need a little bit more information. Thanks again, and wish I could watch TV with all of you. Bye.